The city never truly rested, and neither did the ripples of Alessandro De Luca's defiance. Word of the night's events traveled silently, carried by whispers in dark alleys, smoke-filled mafia clubs, and the hidden corridors of state offices. Rivals reeled from his decisive response, but instead of cowering, they escalated, pooling resources for a retaliation that would test every ounce of his power and every beat of his dark love for Lina. That morning, Alessandro awoke to find the estate unusually quiet. The usual hum of staff, the faint shuffle of footsteps, even the soft laughter of Lina, had been replaced by a tense, foreboding silence. Marco appeared at his door, face grim. "It's coming," he said simply. "A full strike. They're mobilizing across the city." Alessandro's eyes narrowed, mind sharpening with focus. "They've underestimated me for the last time." Within hours, the underworld erupted into chaos. Gunfire at docks, hijacked shipments, ambushes outside mafia clubs, and threats layered upon threats. The city itself seemed to shudder under the weight of invisible wars. Alessandro coordinated silently, using his network of contacts, loyal enforcers, and alliances with corrupt officials to control the spread of chaos, all while ensuring Lina remained untouched. Every message he intercepted, every movement he anticipated, became a shield around her. Lina, now older in awareness and courage, watched her world transform. She moved through the estate with precision, learning the subtle art of observation, how to detect strangers, notice hidden cameras, and read tension in voices. One evening, she approached Alessandro as he studied maps detailing rival operations. "I want to help," she said firmly.
Alessandro hesitated.
Love had made him vulnerable once. Could he risk it again? Yet when he looked into her eyes, he saw understanding, sharpness, and determination. "Very carefully," he said, the single phrase heavy with caution and trust. The following night, the rivals launched their most audacious attempt. A convoy of vehicles approached the estate, armed and ruthless. But Alessandro had anticipated this. From hidden positions, his men moved like shadows, intercepting the attackers with precision and terrifying efficiency. Explosions rocked the outskirts, gunfire shattered the night. But inside the estate, Alessandro moved with unwavering calm, his every decision a calculated mix of brutality and protection. Lina observed from a safe vantage point, heart racing but mind clear. She saw her father figure, protector, and mentor move with lethal grace, neutralizing threats with the certainty of a man who had survived decades of betrayal. In that moment, she understood. Power was not only in wealth or fear, it was in the determination to protect what you love, no matter the cost. By dawn, the street outside was silent. Bodies lay where they had fallen, vehicles abandoned, and the city's whispers grew louder. Alessandro stood in the foyer, Lina beside him, surveying the aftermath. "They thought they could break us," he said softly. "They were wrong." Her small hand touched his arm. "Will they come again?" "Yes," he admitted. "But now they know. Love makes a man stronger than fear ever could." The next days were a tense blend of vigilance and care. Alessandro fortified the estate, trained Lina in strategy and observation, and used his influence across clubs, businesses, and state contacts to send silent warnings. Meanwhile, Elena Russo returned, her presence as sharp and authoritative as ever. "De Luca," she said, voice icy, "you're creating a war that no child should witness. Step carefully. You cannot control everything." Alessandro's gaze hardened, but his voice remained calm. "I'm not controlling everything. I'm protecting what matters." The moral and emotional stakes escalated further when a confidential tip arrived. The coalition of rival mafia families planned to strike not at the estate, but at the very heart of Alessandro's business empire, clubs, shipments, and contacts. Simultaneously, failure to act could dismantle decades of influence. He called a meeting with Marco and his trusted enforcers. "We do not negotiate. We do not hesitate. Tonight, we demonstrate what happens when someone threatens what we hold sacred." Lina, aware yet composed, insisted on accompanying him to the command center, where maps, surveillance, and communication devices displayed the city's network like veins of blood. "I can help," she said. "I can see patterns they can't." Alessandro studied her, pride and fear mingling. "Then you stay close, observe, and trust nothing without proof. Night fell. The city became a chessboard of shadows. Alessandro coordinated strikes with deadly efficiency, countering ambushes, reinforcing vulnerable points, and anticipating betrayals before they happened. Rival factions fell one by one, caught off guard by the blend of calculated violence, strategic intelligence, and Alessandro's dark aura. A man whose humanity had become the sharpest weapon of all. By sunrise, the city's streets were littered with the consequences of the night's battle. Reports of incapacitated rivals, dismantled operations, and lost leverage spread through the underworld. Alessandro returned to the estate, Lena waiting in the foyer, eyes bright with understanding. "We won again?" she asked. "For now," he said softly, lifting her into his arms. "But the world will always test us. That's why we must be ready, always." And in that quiet moment, Alessandro realized that his empire, his reputation, and his power, all the things he had built for decades, were nothing compared to the life he had sworn to protect. Lena, the orphan who had asked a simple question at a train station, had become the center of his universe. The reason he fought harder, planned better, and loved with a depth no one in the city had ever seen. Somewhere in the city, enemies whispered, plotting their next move. But Alessandro De Luca, fueled by dark love, unwavering loyalty, and the sharpest edge of power, had proven one truth. Nothing, not wealth, fear, or political influence, could ever break a man protecting what he truly loved. The city never truly slept, and neither did Alessandro De Luca. Nights became his battlefield, even when he was home. Every phone buzz, every shadow, every whispered rumor could carry a threat. But Lena's presence softened the edges of his vigilance in ways he hadn't expected. She moved through the estate with cautious curiosity, asking questions about the world he had meticulously controlled, and somehow, her innocence made the dangers sharper, more real. One evening, as rain slashed against the windows and lightning split the sky over New York City, Lena asked a question that stopped him mid-step. "Why do people hate you?" Alessandro crouched beside her on the sofa, a cup of tea cooling in his hand. The lightning illuminated his face, revealing lines of experience that had hardened decades of power. "They don't hate me," he said slowly. "They fear me, and they want what I control." Her small fingers traced the rim of the cup. "Even me." His eyes softened, but the shadow behind them didn't fade. "No, you're not theirs to want." That night, the estate's tranquility shattered. The walls were designed to withstand attacks, yet the alarm blared like a scream through the corridors. Gunfire cracked across the driveway. Alessandro moved with the precision of a predator who had hunted in shadows for decades. The sound of glass shattering, tires screeching, and distant sirens became the soundtrack of his anger and protectiveness. Lena, wide-eyed, clutched his coat as he pulled her behind the fortified entrance hall. "Stay close," he whispered, voice calm but dangerous. "No one touches you." Outside, masked figures moved through the rain like shadows with intent. They were professional, organized. Alessandro recognized the signature immediately. A rival Mafia hood had decided to test his boundaries again, to challenge him by threatening the one thing he held most dearly. He didn't run. He didn't call for backup. He became a storm. Every move precise, every decision ruthless. One by one, the intruders were neutralized with a mix of silent efficiency and overwhelming force. By the time the police arrived, unaware of the deeper war raging in the city's veins, the threat was gone. Only the echo of footsteps and the smell of rain and gunpowder remained. Lena's trembling form pressed against him. "Did they die?" she asked softly. Alessandro held her, the rain dripping from his hair onto her coat. "Yes, and they will think twice before testing me again." The next day, the city seemed oblivious. Yet inside the underworld, whispers spread. The orphan in the boss's house had shifted the power balance. Alessandro's empire was no longer just about deals, clubs, or contacts. It was personal, emotional, dangerous. He returned to the office in the morning, still damp from the night's storm. Elena Russo, the state liaison, was waiting. Her expression was unreadable. "You're playing with fire, Mr. De Luca," she said, voice steady but sharp. "Do you realize what it means to tie a child to this world?" "I do," he replied evenly. And yet some fires need protecting, not extinguishing. Her eyes narrowed. You think you can protect her and control the city at the same time? That's not a choice. That's a gamble. Alessandro's lips tightened. Then I'll play better than anyone. Meanwhile, Lena adapted to a life she never knew she could have. Tutors, training, lessons in the ways of the city and its dangers. Though Alessandro was careful not to overwhelm her. Each day, she asked more, learned more, and her curiosity became as sharp as the man who protected her. Yet in her innocence, she asked the questions he feared most. Do you like me? Alessandro froze for a moment. No one had asked him that in decades. I care about you, he said finally, choosing truth over pretense. More than anyone else. Her small hand touched his cheek, searching for warmth in a world of cold power. That's okay, she said softly. I like you too. But the world outside didn't pause for tender moments. Rumors reached other crime families, whispered in the smoke-filled rooms of Mafia clubs. Deals began to falter. Enemies plotted not just against Alessandro but against Lena, recognizing her as leverage. One night, in the dim light of his private study, Alessandro reviewed photographs, intercepted messages, and maps of the city. Every contact he had cultivated for decades was ready for war. And yet he felt a pull in a direction he hadn't known existed. Toward love, toward protection, toward something greater than power alone. Then came the message that changed everything. A kidnapping threat, precise and chilling. Lena was the target. No mistakes. No witnesses. Just the child. Alessandro didn't call the police. He didn't negotiate. He moved like the city had taught him, swift, ruthless, and unseen. The rival mafia hood responsible for the threat would learn the true meaning of power, not just wealth or contacts, but the dangerous aura of a man willing to destroy anything to protect what he loved. By dawn, the streets were quiet. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Alessandro returned to the estate, Lena asleep in her room. He watched her, thinking of the first day he met her at the station. Alone, afraid, uncertain. Now she slept safe because he had chosen her over every rule, every alliance, every consideration of consequence. The underworld would talk. The state would watch. And somewhere, enemies would calculate their next move. But Alessandro De Luca was no longer just a boss. He was a man with love in his chest, a child's trust in his hands, and a city's silent respect hanging over his head like a crown forged in shadows. And Lena, the orphan who had asked a simple question at the station, had changed the course of his life forever. The train station never slept, but that night it felt like it was holding its breath. New York City hummed low and dangerous, its lights flickering like nervous eyes, its underground veins full of secrets. People rushed past without looking, coats pulled tight, souls closed tighter. In the middle of that chaos stood a man who made the noise soften without trying. He was tall, dressed in black wool, his posture calm, controlled, powerful. The kind of man who didn't need bodyguards close to be protected. The kind of man the city itself respected. His name was Alessandro De Luca, though very few dared to say it out loud. To the world, he was a quiet businessman. To New York City power and contacts control, he was something else entirely. A shadow behind deals, a voice behind doors, a man whose word carried weight in mafia clubs, courtrooms, and state offices alike. He ruled not with chaos but with calm. Not with rage but with precision. His power was old, disciplined, inherited, and sharpened by loss. And yet, in that moment, none of it mattered. Because standing in front of him was a small girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Her jacket was too thin for the cold. Her shoes were worn at the toes. Dark hair fell into her eyes, but she didn't push it away. She looked up at him without fear, without awe. Just curiosity. Her voice cut through the station like a soft blade. You're all alone? Time slowed. Alessandro blinked once. No one asked him questions. They asked favors. They asked forgiveness. They asked permission to live. But this child, this orphan with hollow eyes and a steady gaze, had asked something else entirely. He looked around instinctively. No parents. No guardians. No hands reaching for her. Just her. Alone. So are you, he replied calmly. She shrugged. I'm used to it. Those 4 words landed harder than any threat ever had. Something shifted inside him. A memory he had buried deep. A cold hallway. A closed door. The sound of footsteps leaving him behind forever. Humanity stirred where only discipline lived. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena." That was the moment everything began to change. The station cameras would later be reviewed. Security guards would whisper. A senator would make a phone call. A rival mafia hood would panic. Because from the second Alessandro De Luca knelt to meet an orphan's eyes, the balance of power quietly tilted. He didn't know it yet, but love, unexpected and dangerous, had just entered his life. Lena studied him like she was reading a book she'd already seen before. "You don't belong here," she said. "I do," he answered. "I own places like this." She frowned. "You don't look rich." That almost made him smile. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. She hesitated. Just a second. Enough to tell him everything. "I don't know."
Alessandro stood slowly.
People passed by, unaware they were brushing shoulders with a man whose decisions shaped the city. He took off his coat and placed it gently around her shoulders. The child stiffened at first, unused to kindness, then relaxed into the warmth. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. "Always." That single word echoed. Across the city, men waited for Alessandro's call. Deals were paused. Enemies watched clocks. But for the first time in decades, the mafia boss ignored it all. He held out his hand. "Come with me." "Why?" she asked. He searched for the answer and found none that fit his world. Because no one should be alone at a station at night. And so she took his hand. From that moment, rumors would spread. The kingpin had softened. The wolf had found a reason to care. But none of them understood the truth. This wasn't weakness. This was humanity returning to power. As the car pulled away from the station, Lena fell asleep against the leather seat. Alessandro watched her quietly, his reflection staring back from the tinted window. He knew the rules. He knew the danger. Bringing an orphan into his world meant enemies would see leverage. But for the first time he didn't care. Because something older than mafia rules had awakened. Love. Dark love. Unexpected love. The kind that rewrites destinies. And somewhere deep in New York City's underworld, someone noticed. Days blurred into nights as the city's underworld shifted like a living organism, always testing, probing, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. Alessandro De Luca had learned long ago that patience was a weapon, but the presence of Lena made patience almost unbearable. Every sound, every shadow, every unexpected knock became a potential threat. Yet amid this tension, a strange rhythm emerged. Moments of laughter, small acts of tenderness, fleeting warmth between a man hardened by decades and a child who had taught him what it meant to care without condition. One evening, the estate's horizon was painted with the dying sun, blood-red and ominous. Lena wandered through the gardens, her curiosity untempered by fear. Alessandro followed at a measured distance, observing her carefully. "You're growing too bold," he said lightly, though there was no humor in his tone. She stopped and looked up at him, eyes bright. "I need to know the world if I'm going to survive it." He knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "The world is cruel," he said softly, "but it also remembers who protects it." That night, an urgent call shattered their fragile calm. A rival faction had kidnapped one of Alessandro's trusted lieutenants, a man who knew too much and had been careless. The message was simple: deliver Lena, or he dies. Alessandro's hands tightened around the phone. For the first time in decades, his pulse raced, not from anticipation, not from strategy, but from the raw, primal fear of losing her. He called his inner circle immediately, the urgency in his voice cutting through the usual calm like a knife. "Prepare the car," he ordered. "We move now. No mistakes." The drive through New York City was tense, rain-slicked streets reflecting neon lights, shadows hiding every corner. Alessandro's mind raced through possibilities, calculating threats, contingencies, escape routes. Every instinct honed over decades screamed. Yet beneath it all was a singular, terrifying thought. This is Lena's life. I cannot fail. They arrived at the warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The building loomed dark and silent, a trap waiting. Alessandro stepped out, gun in hand, moving like a predator. The men outside, young, brash, overconfident, didn't recognize the calm fury in his eyes. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and they would see the cost of crossing him. Inside, the lieutenant was bound but unharmed, terrified eyes meeting Alessandro's as he approached. "You're safe," Alessandro said, voice quiet but loaded with menace. "Because I will not let them touch what is mine." The confrontation escalated swiftly. Gunfire erupted, a deadly dance of precision and instinct. Alessandro moved like water, every motion calculated, every shot deliberate. By the time the dust settled, the rival faction lay incapacitated or fleeing, their arrogance shattered. The lieutenant was free, trembling but alive. Alessandro, drenched in sweat and rain, allowed himself only a single thought: none of this matters if she is in danger. Returning to the estate, he found Lena waiting in the foyer, eyes wide and aware. "Was it bad?" she asked. He crouched to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It was dangerous," he admitted. "But I protected you." Her small hand touched his cheek, a gesture of trust that anchored him more than any loyalty or power could. "You always will, won't you?" "Yes," he said, the single word heavy with promise. "Always." The following days were filled with quiet lessons. Alessandro trained Lena in subtlety, awareness, and observation. He taught her that power could be both shield and weapon, that influence often mattered more than force, and that the world respected only those who carried authority with unshakable calm. Lena absorbed every word, her eyes bright with understanding, her questions sharp and probing. Yet, the city never ceased testing him. Elena Russo returned, this time with threats cloaked in bureaucratic necessity. "De Luca," she said, voice measured but icy, "your protection of that child risks more than your empire. It risks innocent lives. You cannot control everything." Alessandro's gaze was unwavering. "I do not control everything," he admitted. "But I control what matters most." Elena studied him, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. "And that is?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked to the window, staring at the city sprawling beneath him, lights twinkling like stars trapped in concrete. "Her," he said finally. "She matters more than all of this." That night, Alessandro could not sleep. He moved through the halls of his estate, checking doors, windows, and cameras. Every precaution mattered, yet his mind kept returning to Lena's face, the small, fearless, curious girl who had entered a world of darkness and taught him the meaning of vulnerability. He realized that for the first time in his life, he was not thinking about deals, territories, or power. He was thinking about her, her safety, her future. And somewhere, in the shadows of New York City, enemies were plotting again. They saw her presence as a weakness, a lever to manipulate Alessandro, to fracture the empire he had built. But Alessandro De Luca had learned long ago that true power was not measured by fear or money, but by what or whom you were willing to protect at any cost. The next morning, Lena found him in the library, studying maps and lists, planning contingencies. "Are they coming again?" she asked, small voice steady despite the threat looming. Alessandro looked at her, a rare smile touching his lips. "They will try," he admitted. "But they will learn that I do not play by the rules they understand. Love, loyalty, and protection. These are my weapons now." And in that moment, the orphan who had asked a simple question at the station had become more than a child in need of protection. She had become a reason, a force that could change the course of empires, topple rival factions, and rewrite what it meant to be powerful. The first time Lena heard the gunshot, she didn't scream. That surprised everyone. It cracked through the night air just beyond the iron gates, sharp and deliberate, echoing against stone like a warning carved into sound. The house reacted instantly, lights shifting, guards moving, radios murmuring coded words. But Lena only sat up in bed, small hands gripping the blanket, eyes fixed on the door. Alessandro was already there. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He opened the door and stepped inside like the night itself answered to him. The gun rested low in his hand, not raised, not hidden. Honest. Controlled. "It was far," he said calmly. "You're safe." She studied his face. Someone was angry. "Yes. Because of me?" That question hit harder than the shot. No, he said firmly. Because of themselves. She nodded, accepting it the way children do when they choose trust over fear. Alessandro stayed until her breathing slowed again. Only when she slept did he step out. In the corridor, Marco waited. His face was tight. They're testing boundaries, Marco said. No signature. No follow-up. Just noise. Alessandro's eyes were dark steel. They want my attention. They have it.
No, Alessandro replied.
They want her. Silence followed, the kind that understood consequences. By morning, New York City power and contacts control shifted without the public ever knowing why. Phone calls were returned faster. Permits were delayed. A club on the east side suddenly failed inspection. A senator canceled a lunch. Pressure moved invisibly, precisely. Alessandro never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Lena's life became structured but gentle. Tutors instead of schools. Doctors who spoke softly. Guards who learned to smile. She drew pictures and left them in unexpected places. One ended up on Alessandro's desk. 2 stick figures holding hands in front of a very large house. He stared at it longer than he stared at contracts worth millions. Is that you? He asked later. Yes. And me. Yes. He said nothing. Weeks passed. Then months. And the world noticed something dangerous. Alessandro De Luca was changing. He attended fewer Mafia clubs at night, but when he did, the rooms went quieter than before. Respect didn't fade, it sharpened. Men watched him closely, trying to understand the shift. Some mistook it for softness. They were wrong. At one club, smoke thick and music low. A rival lieutenant laughed too loudly. I hear you're running a daycare now. The laughter died when Alessandro looked at him. He didn't threaten. He didn't move. The man was removed before midnight and never seen again. That was the lesson. You could challenge power. You could challenge territory. You could never challenge what Alessandro loved. Lena sensed the weight around him even when he hid it. One evening she asked quietly, "Do you get tired?" He considered lying. "Yes," he said instead. "Of being strong?" "Yes." She took his hand. "You don't have to be strong with me." That was when he realized something terrifying. She wasn't his weakness. She was his anchor. But anchors attract storms. A woman entered the story quietly. Her name was Elena Russo, a state liaison with eyes sharp enough to cut lies in half. She came officially for zoning disputes. Unofficially, she came because the state had noticed a pattern. She saw Lena's drawing on the desk. "Didn't know you had family," Elena said lightly.
I do, Alessandro replied.
Her gaze lingered. Calculating. Not cruel. Curious. "Be careful," she warned as she left. "When humanity enters power, the world tests it." That night a package arrived. No name. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Lena at the garden gate. Alive. Unharmed. But watched. Alessandro didn't break the glass he was holding. He set it down carefully. "They know," Marco said quietly. "Yes. What do we do?" Alessandro picked up his phone. "We remind them," he said, voice calm and lethal, "who I was before I learned how to love." And somewhere deep in the city, men began to disappear. Not loudly. Not messily. Just enough to send a message older than fear. The war had begun. The city's underworld was restless, whispering of Alessandro De Luca's unprecedented choice. To protect something human in a world built on fear and cold calculation. Rival factions watched, waited, and miscalculated. Believing that love made a man vulnerable. They were wrong. Alessandro's protection of Lena transformed him, sharpened him, made him unpredictable in ways that wealth and influence never could. One rainy night, a tip arrived through Alessandro's network. An encrypted message pointing to a planned attack on the estate. The sender was anonymous, but the signature was unmistakable. A coalition of rival mafia leaders, united for the first time to challenge his control. Alessandro didn't hesitate. He gathered Marco, his closest confidant, and a hand-picked group of enforcers, moving through secret passages and surveillance points he had built decades ago. Every movement was precise, every strategy calculated. Lena, now keenly aware of danger, watched him prepare. "You're going to fight them?" she asked, fear and curiosity mingling in her voice. Alessandro crouched beside her, eyes intense but soft. Yes. And you're going to stay safe. Always. Her small hand brushed his cheek. I trust you. The rain lashed against the estate as the first wave of attackers approached. Masks and weapons gleamed in the darkness, but Alessandro was already waiting unseen, every exit controlled, every advantage anticipated. The initial confrontation was brief but brutal: gunfire, tactical maneuvers, and silent threats that carried the weight of a man who had survived decades of betrayal. By the time the attackers realized what had happened, several lay incapacitated, and the rest fled, their plans shattered. Inside, Alessandro moved silently to check on Lena. She stood in the study, eyes wide but steady, her hands gripping a chair for support. Did they leave? She asked. Yes, he said, voice low and calm, though his body still thrummed with adrenaline. And they will think twice before returning. But the victory was temporary. A message arrived shortly after. A photograph of Lena taken from afar, this time with a note: you cannot protect her forever. Alessandro's jaw tightened. He realized that the stakes had escalated beyond territorial control or mafia politics. This was no longer about power in clubs or contacts in the state. It was about a single life intertwined with his empire. And that made him dangerous in ways no one could predict. The following days were tense. Alessandro fortified the estate, updated security protocols, and increased surveillance, but he also began training Lena. Not in combat but in awareness. She learned to read people, notice inconsistencies, and recognize threats before they arrived. Her understanding of danger grew, matched by a cautious maturity that belied her age. Elena Russo returned again, her sharp eyes assessing not just Alessandro but Lena. This child changes everything, she said, voice measured but concerned. You're risking more than you know. Alessandro did not flinch. I know exactly what I risk, he said. And I accept it. Lena approached him later that evening. Do you ever get scared? She asked. Yes, he admitted, a rare vulnerability breaking through his controlled exterior. But fear is nothing compared to losing someone I care about. Her small hand rested on his arm. I care about you too, she said softly. The revelation settled over him like a fire. Love, dark, unexpected, and dangerous, had changed the rules of his life. Every decision, every act of power, every calculated move now carried emotional weight. The city, with all its corruption, alliances, and power struggles, became a backdrop to the single truth. Protecting Lena was more important than maintaining the empire itself. Then came the ultimatum. A coalition of rival factions demanded a meeting, implying that Alessandro's empire could remain intact only if Lena was handed over. The letter was clear, precise, and lethal in its suggestion. Alessandro studied it carefully, eyes narrowing.
Marco Guati. Tensión evident.
Do you negotiate? He asked. Alessandro's voice was quiet, deadly calm. No one threatens what I love. They will learn that the hard way. Plans were drawn, contingencies made, and the city became the stage for a confrontation that would test loyalty, morality, and power. Alessandro's every move was calculated not just for survival, but for the protection of a life that had become his anchor, his reason, and his weapon. Night fell, rain drenching the streets, as Alessandro prepared to face the coalition. Lena, aware of danger but unafraid, stood beside him, small yet resolute. I'm not afraid, she whispered. You should be, he said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But your courage makes me stronger. And so, in the heart of New York City, a battle of shadow and strategy began. Rival mafia leaders, state interests, and the underworld's finest faced a man whose love had turned him into something far more formidable than they had ever imagined. Alessandro De Luca was no longer just a boss. He was a protector, a force of nature, a man who would bend the city itself to safeguard what mattered most. By the end of that night, bodies were left silent, alliances shattered, and the city whispered of a new kind of power, one born not of fear, but of love, loyalty, and the unwavering determination to protect what is most precious. Lena, exhausted but safe, looked up at him. We won. He smiled softly, lifting her into his arms. For now, he said. But always remember, The world will test us again. She nodded, her small hand gripping his coat. And Alessandro realized that in protecting her, he had discovered the ultimate strength. One that no weapon, no alliance, and no enemy could ever match. The following week, New York City seemed calm on the surface, but beneath the streets, currents of danger rippled faster than anyone could see. Alessandro De Luca moved through his empire like a shadow, touching every corner of the city, inspecting every deal, ensuring that no thread could unravel the fragile protection he had woven around Lena. But the underworld doesn't respect peace, and enemies smelled weakness where there was only love. It began with subtle threats. Anonymous calls, messages slipped under doors, mysterious figures shadowing deliveries. Then came the first brazen act. A mafia club on the east side, one of Alessandro's most loyal operations, exploded in a flash of fire and fury. It was meant to send a message: your world can burn. Alessandro arrived at the scene moments later. The crowd panicked, scrambling from the flames and smoke. He didn't run toward the fire, he stepped through it. Guards tried to restrain him, but he brushed them aside. Inside, the club was a mess of twisted metal, shattered glass, and terrified employees. Yet no one dared speak until he raised his hand. Silence fell, not from fear of law enforcement, but from the sheer weight of his presence. "Everyone is safe," he said, voice low, deliberate, and deadly calm. "I want names. I want details. And I want whoever did this found." The investigation moved swiftly. In hours, Alessandro had traced the attack to a rival faction trying to destabilize him, while knowing he couldn't touch their families without consequences. But Alessandro didn't hesitate. He made a choice that would echo through every mafia club and alley in the city. The faction would feel his power, not just financially or politically, but personally. Meanwhile, Lena watched the events unfold from the estate. Curiosity mingled with fear. She had begun to understand the dangerous game she was living in. "Why do they want to hurt you?" she asked one evening as Alessandro cleaned a weapon in his private room. "Because I control more than they can," he replied without looking up. "Because I make choices they cannot." She studied him, her small face serious beyond her years. "Does it scare you?" Alessandro finally met her gaze, a flicker of something human breaking through the hardened exterior. "No, not for me. For you." And it was true. His empire, his power, his respect, all of it meant nothing if she was in danger. He began teaching her subtle lessons: how to read people, how to notice danger before it arrived, how to survive in a world that rarely forgave weakness. She absorbed everything like a sponge, eager and unafraid. The next day brought a meeting with state officials, a rare confrontation Alessandro never sought lightly. Elena Russo stood firm across the table, papers detailing zoning issues and suspicious financial movements. "De Luca," she said, voice clipped, "you can't keep bending rules for her sake. Sooner or later, someone will push back. And not just in your world." "I'm aware," he replied smoothly. "And I'll be ready." She studied him, suspicion and fascination in her eyes. "You're reckless," she said finally. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps I've learned that some things are worth the risk." Back at the estate, a courier arrived with an unmarked envelope. Inside were photographs of Lena, taken from afar as she walked to a nearby park for tutoring. The message was clear: she is the leverage. Alessandro's face hardened. This was no longer a threat to him. It was a threat to everything he held dear. He immediately assembled his inner circle, men who had been with him through wars, betrayals, and state corruption. "We move tonight," he said, voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "We find them first." The night air was thick with rain as Alessandro and his men moved through the city unseen, their presence known only to those who dared watch too closely. Every street corner, every alley, every shadow was scouted and controlled. And then he saw them, two men with rifles, watching the entrance to a secluded building where Lena had been lured. Time slowed.
Alessandro assessed.
One wrong move and the child could be hurt. But hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. He signaled Marco, and they moved with silent precision. The two men never saw it coming. Within seconds they were disarmed, incapacitated, and left for authorities to find. Alive but terrified, a lesson etched into memory. Alessandro returned to Lena, holding her close. "It's over." he whispered, though he knew it would never truly be. The city would continue to test boundaries, enemies would continue to plot, but for tonight she was safe. And that was enough. Sitting by her side, he finally allowed himself to let the exhaustion of weeks seep in. He realized something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Loving someone in his world didn't make him weak, it made him unstoppable. Every deal, every alliance, every contact in the city now existed not just for power but for protection. Lena, asleep in his arms, murmured something in her dreams. "You're all mine." Alessandro held her tighter. In that moment, amidst the storm of Mafia warfare, state scrutiny and unrelenting danger, he understood the truth. Love, dark and unexpected, could be the most powerful weapon of all. And somewhere in the shadows, eyes watched them, calculating the next move. Alessandro knew this was only the beginning. The city had never felt heavier. Rain-slicked streets reflected the red glow of distant fires, the aftermath of failed attacks and retaliations. Alessandro De Luca knew that the coalition of rival factions, bruised but alive, would not relent. They were desperate, reckless, and now dangerously cunning. Every ally had been called, every contingency prepared, yet the weight of moral choice pressed upon him like a storm. Lena's life, the most precious thing he had ever vowed to protect, hung at the center of it all. That night, he moved through the estate with measured caution. Lena watched from a window, her small figure tense but alert. "Do you think they'll try again?" she asked, voice calm but edged with understanding. "They will," he admitted, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "But that is why we are ready." Preparations were meticulous. Hidden perimeters, surveillance, and traps were set across the city. Yet Alessandro knew the final test would not be a mere attack. The coalition's desperation made them unpredictable. And desperation could be lethal. Hours later, a black SUV approached the estate. The engine hummed quietly, almost innocuous. But Alessandro's trained eyes spotted it immediately. An elite strike team, professional, fast and silent. He signaled to Marco and the inner circle. "Positions." Now, inside the estate, Lena crouched behind a fortified wall, observing with calculated composure. "I see 4 on the east perimeter and 2 on the rooftops," she whispered. "If they move together, they'll trigger the alarm." Alessandro's eyes narrowed. "Good. We'll make them believe the house is empty." The confrontation began with eerie precision. The strike team advanced, confident they were walking into a routine operation. Instead, they encountered shadows moving like ghosts, silent and lethal. Alessandro and his men, coordinated by Lena's sharp observations, neutralized each threat with brutal efficiency. By the time the attackers realized the scale of resistance, several were incapacitated, their operation destroyed before it began. But the real challenge arrived shortly after. A call to Alessandro's private line, voice distorted, a rival faction speaking with calm menace. "De Luca," they said, "your child is no longer collateral. She is the price. Choose. Surrender your empire or lose her." Alessandro's hand tightened on the receiver. His empire had always been about control, fear, and respect. But now control alone would not save what mattered. He faced a moral choice that struck at the core of every principle he had built his life on. Surrender territory and power to protect love, or risk everything to maintain dominance. Silence fell across the estate. Marco guatì, tensión sic. Alessandro's mind raced through every possibility, every consequence. Then slowly, a dangerous smile formed on his lips. "We do not surrender. But we do not fight blindly. Prepare everything. Tonight, we remind them who controls the city, and what happens when love becomes a weapon." The final night unfolded like a storm. Rival factions moved with desperation, attacking multiple fronts, attempting diversionary strikes to divide Alessandro's attention. Explosions shook the streets. Gunfire tore through the night, and chaos seemed poised to consume the city. Yet Alessandro, calm and precise, orchestrated defenses and counterattacks with deadly efficiency. Lena's voice guided movements, her small figure central to strategy. "They're regrouping on the west side. They're overconfident." Alessandro's eyes met hers. "Then we take the advantage." In the culmination of planning, execution, and instinct, Alessandro turned the city itself into a battlefield where he held every advantage. Rival leaders, desperate and panicked, found themselves outmaneuvered, their strikes neutralized, their leverage shattered. By sunrise, the streets were silent, the coalition defeated, their threat eliminated. Back at the estate, Alessandro held Lena close. Her small arms wrapped around him tightly, her trust and courage etched into every heartbeat. "Did we win?" she asked. "Yes," he whispered. "Because some things are worth more than power, more than fear, more than everything else." And for the first time in decades, Alessandro De Luca allowed himself to breathe. His empire remained intact, his city secure, and the orphan who had once asked a simple question at a station had become the reason he had fought, the reason he had loved, and the ultimate force that made him unstoppable. Elena Russo arrived quietly, observing the aftermath with respect and caution. "You've changed the rules," she said softly. Alessandro looked at her, then down at Lena. "No," he replied. "I've revealed the truth. Power without love is empty. Fear is fleeting. Loyalty and protection, those are eternal." Lena smiled, small and victorious. In that moment, Alessandro understood that the darkest love, unexpected, dangerous, and fiercely protective, was the strongest power a man could wield. And the city, with all its chaos, corruption, and danger, would remember the night a mafia boss chose humanity over fear and love over empire. The days that followed were tense, almost unbearably so. New York City hummed with the quiet anxiety of a predator waiting in the dark, and Alessandro De Luca felt every vibration of the city as though it were a warning. Rival factions had grown desperate. Their attacks had failed repeatedly, but they were still bold, and desperation made them dangerous. And now the stakes had risen higher than ever. Any misstep could cost lives, not just his empire but Lena's very existence. Alessandro spent long hours in the estate's command center. Maps, surveillance feeds, and encrypted communications spread across every surface. Lena sat beside him, eyes sharp, absorbing every movement, every calculation. She no longer saw herself as merely protected. She was part of the strategy. Her small hand would point at anomalies on the screens. "They're regrouping here," she said, voice steady, surprising even Alessandro. "And this route is clear for a possible strike." He looked at her, pride and fear mingling. "You understand this world too well for your age," he said softly. "I understand enough to survive," she replied, eyes determined. And survival was what Alessandro had sworn to ensure. That night, a message arrived that changed everything. The rival coalition had captured one of Alessandro's closest associates, a man whose knowledge of operations and contacts was unmatched. They demanded Lena in exchange, threatening the life of the loyal enforcer. Alessandro's pulse did not quicken. His plan was already forming, precise and ruthless. But beneath the calm, a dangerous truth stirred. This was the first test of his moral limit. He gathered Marco and his trusted enforcers. "We do not negotiate," he said, voice low and cold. "We strike, we recover, and we end this." The assault was cinematic in its precision. Alessandro moved through the city like a ghost, every step calculated, every action lethal yet efficient. The rival's compound was a fortress, but he had anticipated every weakness, every patrol, every blind spot. With Marco and the team, he infiltrated silently, neutralizing threats before they even realized danger had arrived. Inside, his enforcer was bound but alive, eyes wide with fear and relief. Alessandro freed him without a word, eyes already scanning for Lena's potential threat in the scenario. The rivals, overconfident and panicked by their own mistakes, were quickly subdued. The city, oblivious to the violence, remained unaware that power had shifted yet again. Returning to the estate, Alessandro found Lena waiting, alert yet calm, her presence a reminder of why he fought every battle. "Did anyone get hurt?" she asked softly. "No," he said, his voice carrying the weight of relief. "And they will think twice before threatening us again." But the challenge was far from over. Elena Russo returned, more determined than ever. "De Luca," she said, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension. "You're walking a fine line. Protecting her is one thing. Using her to defy every rule of the city is another." Alessandro met her eyes, calm but resolute. I do not use her. I protect her. That is the difference. She studied him, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. Then you are prepared to pay the cost? He didn't flinch. Whatever it takes. And soon, the city would witness the full weight of that declaration. The next night, a coalition strike hit multiple points in the city simultaneously. Alessandro had predicted the moves, but even with perfect preparation, the intensity was overwhelming. Explosions rocked streets, sirens blared, and the air was thick with smoke and chaos. He moved through it all with calm fury, orchestrating defenses, counterstrikes, and rescues, ensuring Lena's estate remained untouched. At the same time, Lena, sharp and aware, assisted in communication, relaying critical observations that saved lives and ensured no one under Alessandro's protection was harmed. The child who had once been helpless at a train station had become an invaluable part of the operation, her bravery and intelligence shining amid chaos. By dawn, the city lay quiet, the coalition in retreat, defeated but alive, a necessary warning that Alessandro's power now carried not just authority, but an almost unassailable moral weight. He returned to the estate, exhausted, every muscle aching, but his eyes found Lena first. She stood in the foyer, small but fearless, her gaze meeting his with unspoken understanding. You did it, she said softly. We did it, he corrected, lifting her into his arms. Together. In that moment, Alessandro realized the truth that had been growing for months. Love, dark and unexpected, had transformed him into something beyond fear or power. Protecting Lena was no longer a responsibility. It was the ultimate force driving every decision, every action, every calculated move in the city. And though the underworld would continue plotting, the city would continue whispering, and enemies would continue testing limits, Alessandro De Luca knew one unshakable fact. Nothing, no threat, no faction, no law, could ever break a man who fought for love, loyalty, and the life of a child who had taught him what it meant to truly care. The city had finally exhaled, though the scars of conflict were still visible in the streets, in whispered rumors across clubs, and in the wary glances of those who had survived the night's chaos. Alessandro De Luca walked through the estate, every step deliberate, aware of both the empire he had protected and the fragile human life that now defined its true meaning. Lena moved beside him, small but unshakably brave, her eyes reflecting the storm they had endured together. Days passed in a tense quiet. Alessandro allowed himself moments of reflection, considering what the city demanded and what his heart had chosen. The underworld had learned a dangerous truth. The man who ruled through power and fear could also wield love as a weapon, unrelenting and absolute. And Lena, once an orphan asking a simple question at a station, had become the anchor and the reason for his vigilance, his ruthlessness, and his humanity. Elena Russo returned one afternoon, her posture rigid but her eyes softened. You've changed the balance, she said. Not through fear, not through power, but through your choices. You've made it clear that loyalty and humanity matter. Alessandro did not flinch. They always have, he said quietly. I just learned the hard way that protecting what you love is more important than maintaining control over everything else. Meanwhile, Lena absorbed the lessons of the last weeks with surprising maturity. She had seen strategy, danger, and human weakness, but she had also seen trust, protection, and the unexpected depth of Alessandro's dark love. One evening she asked softly, "Do you think they'll ever stop trying?" Alessandro pulled her into his arms, holding her with a strength that had been sharpened by conflict. "They might try," he said, voice low and steady. "But now they know what happens when they threaten what matters most. And we'll be ready." The estate returned to a semblance of normalcy. Guards moved with quiet discipline, security cameras monitored every angle, and yet within its walls, Alessandro allowed moments of tenderness he had never permitted before. He taught Lena to write, to draw, and to read books that once seemed frivolous in a life dominated by business and survival. Yet every lesson contained subtle awareness of the world outside, the dangers she must never ignore. One evening, as the city lights shimmered in the distance, Lena handed Alessandro a small drawing, a simple picture of the two of them holding hands in front of the estate. He studied it silently, the weight of what it represented settling over him. She had taken a piece of his humanity and made it permanent in her own way. "You see this?" she asked, voice quiet. "That's us." "Yes," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Always us." The city may have seen Alessandro De Luca as a boss, a man of power, wealth, and fear. But within the walls of the estate, he was something far more formidable. A protector, a man whose heart had been reshaped by dark, unexpected love, and whose choices now carried both humanity and absolute authority. In the weeks that followed, rivals hesitated, alliances shifted, and the underworld learned to respect not just his empire, but the moral weight behind it. Alessandro's decisions had rewritten the rules. Love could be the sharpest weapon, loyalty the strongest shield, and humanity the ultimate power. Lena, watching him, understood that the man who had once seemed untouchable and unreachable was now profoundly human. And for Alessandro, the orphan's small hand had done what no threat, no rival, and no empire ever could. It had saved him from himself, taught him that even in a world built on fear, love could prevail. One night, standing on the estate balcony, Alessandro looked over the city, lights glimmering like stars trapped in concrete. Lena stood beside him, leaning against his side. "Do you think the city will ever be safe?" she asked softly. Alessandro smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "Safe enough," he said. "Because now we know how to protect what matters most." And in that moment, amidst the quiet hum of a city scarred but surviving, Alessandro understood a truth deeper than power, deeper than fear, deeper than wealth. Love, loyalty, and humanity were forces no empire, no mafia, and no enemy could ever surpass. The orphan's question at the station, "You're all alone?" had not only reshaped Alessandro's life, but had rewritten the rules of an entire city. And through dark love, fierce protection, and unwavering humanity, he had found something worth more than all the power in the world. A family, a purpose, and a reason to exist beyond fear. The final chapter of their saga unfolded like a storm settling over New York City. The rival factions, shattered and humiliated, had retreated into the shadows, their threats reduced to whispers. But Alessandro De Luca knew better than to believe the city could ever be entirely quiet. Power was never dormant. It was simply waiting for the right opportunity to rise again. What mattered most now was not the empire itself, but the life he had sworn to protect. Lena. That morning, Alessandro walked through the estate gardens with her. The air crisp and heavy with the scent of rain-soaked flowers. Lena ran ahead, laughing softly, the sound almost alien in a world defined by violence and fear. Alessandro's eyes followed her. A mixture of awe, relief, and something deeper. A love he had never thought possible for someone so small yet so fierce. "You know," Lena said, pausing to look back at him, "you're kind of scary sometimes. But you're also really nice." Alessandro chuckled softly, the sound low and rare. "I'm not sure I like being called nice," he said, voice teasing yet warm. "But I'll accept it from you." As they walked, a subtle tension lingered in the periphery. Alessandro's instincts, honed over decades, never truly rested. Even now, he scanned the horizon, watching for signs, listening for whispers of danger. And yet, for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life that was not dictated solely by power, fear, and retaliation. By evening, the final confrontation unfolded, not with gunfire or explosions, but in a quiet, tense meeting arranged by the last surviving members of the coalition. They had requested peace, their power fractured, their leaders cautious. Alessandro entered the room, Lena nearby, silent but alert. The rivals hesitated, aware that any misstep would invite ruin. "You have fought well, De Luca," one of the leaders said, voice careful. "But the city is not yours alone." Alessandro's gaze was unflinching, sharp and commanding. "No," he replied. "It never was. But it belongs to those who protect what matters most. And you have already seen what happens when someone threatens it." The rivals left the room, their faces pale, their ambitions broken. The city had learned a new kind of respect, not fear alone, but understanding that Alessandro's humanity, his love, and his loyalty were just as formidable as his wealth and influence. Returning to the estate, Alessandro finally allowed himself to breathe fully. Lena ran into his arms, her small frame clinging to him tightly. "We did it," she whispered. Yes, he said, holding her close. We did it. Together. Days passed in relative calm. The empire remained intact, the city wary but respecting the new balance of power, and Alessandro began to show Lena the softer sides of his world. Moments of laughter, warmth, and peace he had rarely permitted himself. He taught her not only how to survive, but how to live fully within the world's dangers. And she, in turn, taught him patience, joy, and the unexpected strength of love. One evening, standing on the balcony of the estate, Alessandro looked over the glittering skyline. Lena stood beside him, her hand in his, and he realized that the question she had asked at the station so long ago, "You're all alone?" had been answered in a way the city would never forget. He was never alone, and neither was she. Together, they had forged a family from the chaos, a force from the shadows, and a love that defied fear and power alike. Elena Russo visited one last time, observing the quiet aftermath. "You've changed the rules," she said, her tone a mixture of awe and caution. Alessandro's gaze softened, not at her, but at Lena. "No," he said gently. "I've simply followed what matters. Power without love is empty. Authority without protection is meaningless. But loyalty, protection, and humanity, they endure forever." Lena smiled, leaning against him, confident, brave, and safe. "So we're okay now?" "Yes," he whispered. "We're more than okay. We're unstoppable." And in that moment, the city, with all its darkness, corruption, and danger, had learned a truth more enduring than fear. That a mafia boss could be more than ruthless, more than powerful. He could be human, he could love. And he could protect with a force that no weapon, no alliance, and no enemy could ever break. Alessandro De Luca had built an empire, faced death countless times, and survived every betrayal. But the thing that had transformed him, given his life meaning beyond power, was the presence of one small, fearless orphan who had asked a simple question at a station. "You're all alone?" And in answering her, he had discovered the ultimate truth. Love, loyalty, and humanity were the most formidable power of all.